Think about beer for a second. What comes to mind? A hot dog at a baseball game? A frosty mug after mowing the lawn? Maybe it's just that red plastic cup from your college days. It's the world's most popular alcoholic drink, but we don't really give it much respect. It's simple, it's cheap, and for most of us, it's just for fun. But here's the thing. That simple, cheap drink is arguably the single most important technological catalyst in the history of the world. It's the discovery that gave us agriculture, the first cities, written language, and our legal codes. That's not an exaggeration. The story of beer is the story of civilization itself. It's the innovation that convinced us to stop wandering and build communities. It was the world's first currency, the first widespread medicine, and the foundation of our social lives. Without beer, there would be no pyramids, no writing, and probably no us. So go ahead, find a cold one, a Pilsner, an IPA, a stout, it doesn't matter. Settle in and get ready for the incredible and almost completely forgotten story of beer. All right, so we've established that the cheap, simple drink we take for granted has an incredible history. But before we get into all that, I want you to really wrap your head around the scale of this story in our modern world, because it's not just big, it is absolutely mind-boggling. When we say beer is the most popular alcoholic beverage on earth, that isn't even the most surprising statistic. The truth is, beer is the third most popular drink of any kind, right behind water and tea. That's not a typo. More human beings on this planet drink beer than drink coffee, or milk, or juice. And all that popularity adds up to a truly staggering amount of liquid. Every single year, humanity brews and consumes just shy of 200 billion litres of beer, a number so huge it's basically meaningless. So let me put it another way. The amount of beer we drink every year is enough to match the entire flow of the River Thames for more than a month. We have literally created an artificial alcoholic river that flows into every corner of the globe. And the story of how that river got started, well, that's where things get really interesting. So when we imagine how that massive, artificial river of beer got started, it's easy to picture a pretty simple scene. Some Neolithic hunter-gatherer accidentally leaves a bowl of mashed-up grain out in the rain. A few wild yeast spores float in. The sun comes out. And boom, accidental booze. A happy little accident that gave our ancestors their first buzz. And they just decided to keep the party going. But that's not what happened, not even close. The truth is, the first brewers probably weren't trying to have a good time. They were trying not to die. Now, to really understand this, you have to forget everything you know about modern life for a second. You have to imagine a world without one of the most basic things we take for granted: clean water. For our ancient ancestors, every river, every stream, every pond was a potential death sentence. It was the public toilet, the garbage dump, and the animal graveyard, all at once. And of course, they didn't have germ theory. They had no idea what bacteria or microbes were. But they weren't stupid. They could connect the dots. They knew that drinking from the wrong source could lead to a swift and horrible death from dysentery, cholera, or 100 other diseases we don't even think about anymore. Survival was a daily game of Russian roulette, and your water jug was the gun. So, the single greatest challenge for any group of people who wanted to stop wandering and build a village wasn't finding food. It was finding something safe to drink. They needed a stable, reliable source of hydration that wouldn't wipe out their entire community. And it turns out the answer was beer. Because the process of making even the most basic gruel-like beer starts with boiling water, which, completely unintentionally, kills all of the dangerous pathogens. And the small amount of alcohol produced during fermentation then acts as a preservative, keeping the liquid safe to drink for days or even weeks. It was a calorie-rich, nutrient-dense, and most importantly, sterile source of hydration. This wasn't a party drink. This was liquid bread. It was one of the first reliable forms of medicine, and for the people who first figured it out, It was the key that unlocked the door to civilization itself. All right, so we've established that beer wasn't a party drink. It was a survival technology, the key that allowed our ancestors to stop wandering, build villages, and not die from a sip of dirty water. But who figured this out, and where did this revolution begin? To find the answer, we have to travel back in time, way back. About 13,000 years, to a lush, green corridor of land in the Middle East that we now call the Fertile Crescent. This is the genesis point. And living there were a people called the Natufians. Now, I want you to picture the Natufians. These weren't the stereotypical cavemen, but they weren't farmers yet either. They were on the cusp. Hunter-gatherers who had found a land so abundant with wild grains, nuts, and game that they were doing something radical. They were starting to build permanent settlements. They were the first people we know of to start putting down roots before they had even figured out agriculture. And for decades, the story we told ourselves about them was simple. They gathered wild wheat and barley, eventually learned to plant it, and used the grain to make bread. It's a nice, wholesome story. The invention of the staff of life. But what if that story is completely backwards? This brings us to one of the most hotly debated ideas in archaeology, the beer before bread hypothesis. And the more you look at it, the more it makes a crazy amount of sense. Because think about it, making bread with Stone Age technology is an absolute nightmare. You have to harvest the grain, thresh it to remove the seeds, winnow it to get rid of the chaff, and then spend hours and hours grinding it between two rocks into a coarse, gritty flour. The amount of backbreaking labor for one tiny, dense flatbread is just not worth the calories. But making a basic, porridge-like beer, that's much, much easier. You just roughly crush some grains, soak them in water, and let the wild yeast that's everywhere in the air do its thing. The payoff is immediate. You get a thick, calorie-rich gruel that's also a safe, sterile source of hydration. It's food and drink, all in one. So the theory is this. The Natufians weren't domesticating grain because they dreamed of baking. They were domesticating it to ensure a steady, reliable supply for the communal brew. The need for a consistent source of this life-saving liquid is what likely tipped them over the edge from simply gathering wild plants to consciously cultivating them. The agricultural revolution, the single biggest turning point in the story of humanity, wasn't sparked by hunger. It was sparked by thirst. It didn't start with a loaf of bread, it started with a beer. So if the agricultural revolution was really the brewing revolution, what happened next? Where do we see this brand new world built on grain and fermentation really take shape? For that, we have to jump forward a few thousand years, to a place between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Mesopotamia, and to the people who built the world's first true cities there, the Sumerians. Now, if the Natufians were the ones who lit the fuse, the Sumerians were the explosion. They gave us the wheel, the first written language, and massive city-states that were home to tens of thousands of people. And what fueled this incredible leap forward? You guessed it. Beer. For the Sumerians, beer wasn't just a drink. It was everything. It was the standard currency. Workers building the great ziggurats and temples weren't paid in money. They were paid in daily rations of beer. It was a religious offering, a social lubricant, and a staple of the daily diet for everyone from the king down to the lowest field hand. But I want you to get the image of a cold, clear pilsner out of your head right now. That's not what this was. Not even close. Sumerian beer was thick, murky, and unfiltered. It was basically a fermented porridge, full of floating bits of bread and grain husks left over from the brewing process. It was nutritious, sure, but it was basically a chunky, alcoholic soup, and drinking it meant getting a mouthful of semi-fermented mush. So the Sumerians came up with an ingenious piece of technology to solve the problem, one that we still use today for our milkshakes and sodas. They invented the drinking straw. These weren't plastic, of course. They were long reeds, or sometimes precious tubes of gold and lapis for the wealthy. And if you look at Sumerian art, you'll see these incredible scenes of people gathered around a huge communal pot, all leaning in with their long straws, to bypass the floating gunk on top and drink the liquid from below. It was a necessary tool for a fundamental part of their life. And who was making all of this vital stuff? Well, in Sumer, brewing wasn't a job for men in some industrial factory. It was a domestic craft, an extension of baking, and it was almost entirely dominated by women. These were priestesses and tavern keepers, matriarchs brewing for their families and communities. The brewhouse was part of the home, and women were the experts. In fact, this whole operation was so important, so central to their existence, that they gave it its own deity. Her name was Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. And one of the oldest poems in human history, the hymn to Ninkasi, isn't just a prayer. It's actually a recipe, carefully passed down through generations, detailing exactly how to mix the bapir, or beer bread, with water, and how to let it ferment in the great vat. Think about that for a second. The very first civilization to invent writing used that incredible power to write down a beer recipe and turn it into a divine song. If that doesn't tell you how important beer was to building the world we live in, I don't know what does. Okay, so we have the Sumerians literally writing the recipe for beer into their religious hymns and using it to pay the people building their temples. It's an incredible foundation for a society, but they weren't the only ones. In fact, at the same time, another great civilization was taking that exact same idea and using it to build something even more famous, something that stands to this day. I want you to picture the pyramids of Giza. For most of us, one image comes to mind. Hollywood, basically. Thousands of slaves, emaciated and beaten, hauling impossibly heavy blocks of stone up a huge ramp under the blistering Egyptian sun, all while a cruel overseer cracks a whip. That's the story we all know. And it's almost completely wrong. The popular idea that the pyramids were built by slaves is a myth, one that probably got started thousands of years later by the Greek historian Herodotus. The truth, which we know from archaeological evidence, including the workers' own settlements, their well-tended tombs, and even their graffiti, is that the pyramids were built by a massive, highly organized and respected workforce of paid Egyptian laborers. These were skilled craftsmen, stonemasons, and engineers. And if they were paid, that begs the question, what was their salary? It wasn't gold, it wasn't land, their payment was beer. And again, just like in Sumeria, this wasn't the light, bubbly stuff we drink today. This was a thick, calorie-dense, nutritious porridge called heket by the Egyptians. It was liquid bread full of B vitamins and essential nutrients, and it was the perfect fuel for a life of hard, physical labor. And we know exactly how much they were paid because the Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. A standard laborer on the Giza Plateau earned a daily ration of around 4 to 5 liters of beer. That's more than a gallon a day. This wasn't a perk. It wasn't a little something to take the edge off after a long day. This was their wage. This was the fuel that powered the construction of the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. The entire project, this monument that has baffled historians and engineers for millennia, didn't run on whips and chains. It ran on beer. All right, so we've established that beer isn't a perk. It's not a bonus. It's the wage that fueled the construction of the pyramids. And if the foundation of your entire economy is a liquid, what happens when someone tries to cheat the system? What happens when you water down the money? Well, that brings us back to Mesopotamia, to a new power that rose up after the Sumerians, the Babylonians. And it's here, under their legendary king, Hammurabi, that we find one of the most brutal and revealing consumer protection laws ever written. Now, you've probably heard of the Code of Hammurabi. It's one of the oldest and most complete legal documents in history, famously carved into a massive stone stele. It covers everything from property law to marriage contracts. And buried within those 282 laws are a handful that deal specifically with taverns. And this is where it gets wild. Hammurabi was obsessed with a very particular kind of fraud. Tavern keepers who shortchanged their customers, or even worse, watered down their beer. And the penalty for this wasn't a fine. It wasn't jail time. It was death. I'm not exaggerating. Law 108 of the Code of Hammurabi states that if a tavern keeper made the beer to grain ratio too low, if they watered it down, they were to be thrown into the water and drowned. Death for pouring a bad pint. And as crazy as that sounds, it makes perfect sense when you remember what beer actually was. This wasn't just about bad business, it was borderline treason. Think about it. Watering down beer was committing 3 crimes at once. First, it was wage theft. Since beer was a form of payment, a diluted brew was a pay cut. Second, you were robbing people of essential nutrition, replacing the liquid bread they needed to survive with useless, empty liquid. And third, and this is the most important part, you were potentially poisoning them. By adding unboiled, dirty water back into the safe, sterile beer, you were reintroducing all the deadly bacteria that the brewing process had eliminated. You could wipe out an entire crew of workers with a single bad batch. So this wasn't about protecting the quality of a party drink. This law was protecting the integrity of the food supply, the economy, and the public health system all at once. Anyone who tampered with it wasn't just a cheat. They were a direct threat to the stability of civilization itself. So we've spent all this time establishing beer as the fuel of the ancient world, the money that built the pyramids, the public health system of Babylon. But let's be honest, when you think of beer today, you don't really think of Iraq or Egypt, do you? You think of Germany, Belgium, Ireland, England. So how did that happen? How did the cradle of civilization, the place that literally invented civilization with beer, lose its grip on it? How did beer end up the defining drink of the cultures that the Romans and Greeks dismissed as barbarians? Well, the answer is incredibly simple, and it has nothing to do with taste or culture or conquest. It's about gardening. Think about the world map for a second. As the knowledge of brewing spread out from the Fertile Crescent, it ran into 2 very different agricultural realities. To the south and west, you had the Mediterranean basin, Greece, Rome, the Iberian Peninsula. Places with hot, dry summers and mild winters. A climate that is absolutely perfect for growing 2 things, olives and grapes. For them, making wine was easy. The fruit came pre-packaged with all the sugar and yeast it needed. You just crush it and wait. So when they encountered the laborious multi-step process of malting and mashing and boiling grain, they weren't impressed. Wine was civilized. Beer was a weird, chunky porridge for barbarians. Then, if you look to the Far East, you see the same story, but with a different plant. In China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, the climate and agricultural traditions weren't built around fermenting grain for drink. They were built around the tea leaf. Grain was staple food, rice, millet, wheat for noodles. Their beverage culture evolved separately. Which leaves the north, the vast, soggy, and often dreary expanse of Europe north of the Alps. A place far too cold and wet to reliably cultivate grapes and thousands of miles from the nearest tea plant. But what did it have? What grew there in incredible, endless abundance? Grain, barley, wheat, rye, and oats. So, for the peoples of northern Europe, the Celts, the Gauls, the Germanic and Slavic tribes, they faced the exact same problem as the very first settlers in the Fertile Crescent. They needed a safe, reliable, calorie-rich source of liquid. And looking at the world around them, they came to the exact same conclusion. They used what they had. And so, the world neatly fractured into 3 great beverage empires. The empire of wine, centered on the sunny Mediterranean. The empire of tea, across the vastness of the East. And the empire of beer, which now found its heartland in the cold, damp, grain-rich north. It's there, in that so-called beer belt, where the next chapter of our story unfolds. So for the Romans and the Greeks, sipping their wine in the sunny Mediterranean, these northern tribes were nothing more than uncivilized barbarians, drunken, violent, and messy. And sure, there was some truth to that stereotype. But they weren't just messy. They were building a completely different kind of society, one held together not by marble forums or written laws, but by a single, central institution: the alehouse. Now, I want you to get the modern idea of a pub or a bar completely out of your head. This wasn't a place you went for a casual pint after work. For the Germanic and Norse peoples, the great mead or ale hall was the absolute centre of their universe. It was the king's throne room where he received tribute, the courthouse where disputes were settled, the barracks where his warriors slept, the feasting hall where victories were celebrated, and the place where bards sang the epic poems that were their living history. It was everything, all under one long, smoky timbered roof. In fact, think about the most famous story to survive from that entire era: Beowulf. What is that story about? It's about a monster, Grendel, who terrorizes a kingdom by attacking its great hall, Heorot. The ultimate threat to their society isn't a rival army or a famine. It's a creature that makes it impossible for them to gather and drink together. Grendel isn't just killing warriors. He's destroying the very heart of their civilization. And that's because the act of drinking in the hall wasn't just a party. It was a deeply serious political ritual. This is how it worked. A king or a chieftain proved his worth not just by winning battles, but by being a generous ring giver, and more importantly, an ale giver. He would sit on his high seat, his gift stool, and his warriors, his thanes, would gather around him. He would then personally pass around a great horn or a massive cup of ale, and as each warrior drank, they would swear oaths of loyalty to him. They promised to fight for him and to die for him if necessary. This was their contract. This was their constitution. That shared cup was the physical embodiment of the bond between a ruler and his people. The society, the army, the kingdom itself. It was all forged and reforged, night after night, in the warm, noisy, and sacred space of the ale hall. It was a kingdom built on beer. So, we have these barbarian kingdoms, a whole society forged in the sacred ale hall, held together by shared cups of beer. But at the same time, the old world, the world of the Romans, is collapsing. And for centuries, Europe basically goes dark. Libraries are burned, trade routes disappear, and a ton of classical knowledge is just lost. But one technology wasn't lost. In fact, it was about to be saved, refined, and perfected in the most unlikely of places. Inside the quiet, cold walls of Christian monasteries. Now, on the surface, this makes no sense. The wild, drunken world of the pagan ale hall seems like the total opposite of the silent, pious life of a monk. But these monks had a huge problem baked right into their job description: fasting. And I don't mean skipping a meal. I mean brutal, weeks-long fasts, especially during Lent, where solid food was completely off the table. How do you survive that? How do you get the energy for hours of prayer and hard manual labour on just water? And the solution they found is a phrase I want you to remember from the very beginning of our story: liquid bread. The monks discovered what was basically a theological loophole. A strong, unfiltered, nutrient-rich beer wasn't considered food. It was a beverage. The old saying was, liquidum non frangit jejunum. Liquids do not break the fast. And so, they began brewing these incredibly strong, thick beers, known as doppelbocks or double box, not to get drunk, but purely for sustenance. This was their fuel to get through the hardest months of the year. But here's the thing. If your life literally depends on this beer, you can't just wing it. You can't just throw some grain in a pot and hope it turns out okay. You need it to be perfect every single time. And it just so happens that monks were uniquely qualified for the job. They were literate in an age of illiteracy. They were meticulous observers and record keepers, and they had a religious devotion to perfection. So they did what monks do best. They got organized. They started writing everything down. Every ingredient was measured. Every temperature was controlled as best they could. Every outcome was recorded in detailed brewing logs. It was the first time in history that brewing was treated not as a domestic chore or a chaotic ritual, but as a science. They were turning prayer into a research project. They didn't just save brewing through the Dark Ages. They transformed it. They weren't trying to build a business. They were trying to get closer to God. And in the process, they accidentally laid the foundation for every single pint of beer we drink today. So the monks are applying science to survival, turning brewing into a meticulous, repeatable process. They're making the best, most consistent beer in the world, and they've saved the craft from being lost to the Dark Ages. It's an incredible story. But there was one huge, glaring difference between the beer they were brewing and the one you might have in your hand right now. Their beer, and in fact, all beer in Europe for hundreds of years, was missing that characteristic, piney, bitter flavour we associate with, well, with beer. And that's because they weren't using hops. Instead, they were using a proprietary herbal mixture called Gruit, Gruit. It was a blend of botanicals like yarrow, bog myrtle, and wild rosemary, and it did two things. It added flavour to balance the sweetness of the malt, and it acted as a mild preservative. And for centuries, if you wanted to brew beer, you used Gruit. But here's the thing. You couldn't just go pick your own Gruit. The specific recipes were a closely guarded secret. And who controlled that secret? Who owned the exclusive monopoly on the production and sale of Gruit? The Catholic Church, of course. If you were a town or a guild and you wanted to brew and sell beer, you had to buy the rights to the Gruit from the local bishop or prince abbot. It was a massive, incredibly lucrative source of income. It was basically a beer tax, enforced with divine authority. And for a long time, it was the only game in town. But then there was this other plant, a scrappy, resilient weed that grew wild all over northern Europe, a climbing vine that produced these little green cones. It was called the hop. And it turned out, hops were an incredible preservative, way better than Gruit. They kept beer fresher for much, much longer. And they added a sharp, clean bitterness that was, to many people, a lot more refreshing. And the most dangerous thing about it, it was free. This set the stage for a quiet, centuries-long war, the war of Gruit versus hops. On one side, you had the establishment, the church, protecting its monopoly and its revenue stream. On the other, you had secular brewers and growing cities wanting to use this cheaper, better, freely available alternative. The church fought back, denouncing hops as a wicked and pernicious weed. In England, King Henry VIII, before his famous break with Rome, actually banned brewers from using them. But you can't keep a good weed down. And this underground botanical war was about to get a massive, world-changing political catalyst. The Protestant Reformation. Think about it. In 1517, Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. And what's his core argument? He's raging against the financial corruption of the church, against the selling of indulgences, against the idea that you have to pay your way into heaven. It's a fundamental attack on the economic power of Rome. And what was one of the most visible, everyday symbols of that economic power in the beer-drinking heartland of Germany? The Gruit tax. Suddenly, choosing what to put in your beer wasn't just a brewing decision. It was a political and religious statement. To brew with Gruit was to support the old Catholic order. But to brew with hops, that was an act of rebellion. It was a way for Protestant princes and towns to thumb their nose at the Pope and keep that tax money for themselves. And it's in Germany that hops would find their ultimate victory. In fact, just a year before Luther kicked things off, the Duke of Bavaria issued a decree that would change brewing forever. The Reinheitsgebot, or the German Beer Purity Law of 1516. It stated that beer could only be made with 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. That was it. Gruit was officially out. The free Protestant weed had won. And the bitter, refreshing taste of the beer we know today isn't just a flavour profile. It's an echo of a revolution. So the Reinheitsgebot makes it official. The little green weed had won the war. Gruit was out. Hops were in. And while that cemented the bitter, refreshing taste we know and love today, the real revolution wasn't about flavour. Not really. It was about time, literally. Before hops, beer was an intensely local product. It was like fresh milk or a loaf of bread. You drank it where it was made, and you drank it fast, because it would spoil in a matter of days, or, if you were lucky, a couple of weeks. You couldn't build an export business around something with the shelf life of a banana. It was a neighborhood drink, and that's all it could ever be. But hopped beer, that was a different story entirely. The hops were such a powerful preservative that a barrel of beer could now survive for months. It could survive a long sloshing journey on the back of a cart or in the hold of a ship. It could travel, and that one simple fact changed everything. And who was the first to realize just how big this change was? Well, that would be some of the sharpest and most powerful merchants in the world at the time. The Hanseatic League. Now, the Hansa weren't a country. They were a network, a sort of medieval trade cartel of powerful port cities all across northern Europe. Lübeck, Hamburg, Bremen. And these guys saw an economic opportunity that was almost too good to be true. They could use their cities as massive breweries, crank out huge quantities of this new, stable, hopped beer, and then use their shipping network to sell it everywhere. To England, to Scandinavia, to ports all across the Baltic Sea. And that's exactly what they did. For the first time, beer wasn't just being brewed for the local tavern. It was being brewed specifically for export. It wasn't just a drink anymore, it was cargo. But to trade something on that scale, you need one more piece of the puzzle. You need standardization. You can't have every barrel be a different size, a different quality. So the big Hanseatic brewing cities did something quietly revolutionary. They created the standardized export barrel. A barrel from Hamburg was a specific size, holding a specific volume of beer, and it was stamped with the city's mark, an early form of branding, a guarantee of quality. This was a massive deal. It meant that a merchant in London could order 100 barrels of Hamburg beer, sight unseen, and know exactly what he was getting. It turned beer from a craft good into a true commodity. And that branded, standardized barrel, it wasn't just a container. It was the great-grandfather of the modern shipping container, the innovation that turned beer from a local refreshment into one of the first globalized industrial products. So, let's circle back to that big, important-sounding German law we talked about. The Reinheitsgebot, the purity law of 1516. It sounds so clean, so noble, doesn't it? Water, barley, hops. A guarantee of quality, a testament to the German love of good, pure beer. It's a great story. And we've all bought into it. It's one of the best marketing slogans in history. But the truth is, the story we tell ourselves about the purity law, well, it's mostly just that. A story. Its primary goal probably wasn't protecting the drinker from bad beer. It was about protecting the baker from the brewer. Here's the thing. Back in 16th century Bavaria, you had a massive economic problem brewing. Think about the two most important grains for survival, wheat and rye. You need them to make bread, the absolute staple of the medieval diet. But ambitious brewers were also using wheat and rye to make their beers, which gave them different flavors and textures. And this created chaos. Suddenly, the baker and the brewer were in a bidding war for the exact same grains. As they competed, the price of wheat and rye shot through the roof. And when the price of grain skyrockets, so does the price of bread. For the average person, this was a disaster. For the Duke of Bavaria, it was even worse. A hungry, angry population is the last thing any ruler wants. So, what do? You can't just tell brewers to stop brewing. But you can't have your people starving. This is where the Reinheitsgebot is so incredibly, cynically brilliant. It presents itself as a law about what can go into beer, but the real power was in what it said can't. No wheat, no rye. With that one move, Duke Wilhelm IV wasn't creating a quality standard. He was ending a price war. He legally cordoned off barley for the brewers, and in doing so, reserved all the precious wheat and rye exclusively for the bakers. The price of bread stabilized. The public was safe from starvation, and the Duke got to look like a hero, a benevolent protector of his people's beer. It wasn't a purity law. It was protectionist economic policy, masterfully gift-wrapped as a matter of public health, a piece of political genius so effective that half a millennium later, we're still celebrating it for all the wrong reasons. So now we have it. Thanks to a few Hanseatic merchants and a plucky little weed, beer is finally a stable, transportable, global commodity. It's sealed in standardized barrels, guaranteed by a city's stamp, and ready to travel the world. And it couldn't have come at a better time. Because as Europe enters the age of exploration, they're about to have a massive problem on their hands. The same one our very first ancestors had back in the Fertile Crescent. Unsafe drinking water. I want you to imagine being on a wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic for 2 months. The fresh water you brought on board in wooden casks has long since turned stagnant and foul, a breeding ground for slimy algae and deadly bacteria. You are surrounded by an endless ocean of salt water you can't drink. Your life literally depends on the barrels of beer stored in the hold. Just like for the first farmers, it was a safe, sterile, and calorie-rich source of hydration. It wasn't about getting drunk on the high seas. It was about not dying of thirst or dysentery before you even saw land. Which brings us to one of the most foundational stories in American history, the story of the Pilgrims. Now think about the image you have in your head of the Mayflower. Pious, stoic families in black hats and buckled shoes, braving a dangerous journey across the ocean to find religious freedom in a new world. It's a powerful, almost sacred national myth. But their journey had a serious logistical crisis, one that's been conveniently left out of the elementary school plays. In the fall of 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, they were getting desperately, dangerously low on their single most important provision. Not bread, not salted meat, their supply of beer. They were originally bound for Virginia, where other colonies had already been established. But they were way off course, and winter was coming. And according to the diary of one of the passengers, they were forced to make a decision because, in his words, we could not now take time for further search or consideration, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer. The crew was starting to panic, worried there wouldn't be enough beer left for them to make the return journey to England. So the captain put his foot down. They had to land, immediately. They didn't land at Plymouth Rock because of a navigational mistake, or because they saw it as a sign from God. They landed there because they were running out of beer. That's it. The Great American Experiment, a project that would reshape the entire world, was forced into existence because a boat full of religious dissidents and a thirsty crew needed to find a place to park before the booze was gone. It's maybe the most profound example of just how much this simple drink has shaped our world in ways we've completely forgotten. So, the Great American Experiment was kickstarted because a ship captain was terrified he'd run out of beer. And it's this exact idea, beer not as a little luxury, but as an essential, non-negotiable fuel, that's about to completely reshape the world all over again. For that, we have to jump forward about a century and cross back over the ocean to London. But this isn't the London of palaces and royal courts. This is a new London. The world's first true megacity, choking on the smoke and soot of the Industrial Revolution. It's a city exploding with factories, ironworks, and a brand new kind of human being, the industrial labourer. Millions of people are flooding in from the countryside, working brutal, inhuman hours in the first factories, on the docks, and in the construction sites. And what do you need to power that kind of human engine? Calories. An incredible number of them, and you need them cheap, fast, and easy to consume during what few moments of break you get. You need liquid bread. Now, up to this point in the early 1700s, ordering a beer in a London tavern was a fussy, complicated affair. The most popular drink was something called 3 threads, which was exactly what it sounds like. The bartender would have to pull from 3 different casks, usually a pale ale, a brown ale, and an older, stronger, slightly sour ale, and mix them together in your tankard. It was custom, it was slow, and it was wildly inconsistent. until one brewer, a man named Ralph Harwood, had an incredibly simple and frankly genius idea. Why not just brew one single beer that already tasted like that popular blend? A beer that could be made in a single, massive batch and served straight from the cask. He called his creation Entire Butt, which sounds a bit strange to us, but a butt was just a name for a large 108-gallon cask. But that's not the name that stuck. This new brew was dark, it was strong, it was rich in calories, and it was cheap. It was the perfect fuel. And it became an absolute sensation with the city's legions of street and river porters, the men who spent their days doing the back-breaking work of hauling goods all over the city. They loved the stuff. And because the porters drank it morning, noon, and night, the beer soon got a new name. Everyone just started calling it porter. And here's why this is about so much more than just a new recipe. Porter wasn't just a new style of beer. It was a new idea of beer. One engineered for an industrial world. Because it was a single consistent product, it could be brewed on a scale that was previously unimaginable. Brewers like Whitbread and Guinness, yes, that Guinness, built breweries that looked more like factories, with steam engines pumping water and massive vats that held hundreds of thousands of gallons. This was the world's first mass-market, industrial beer. It was formulated with cheap, heavily roasted dark malt that was easy to produce. It was the engine oil of the Industrial Revolution, providing the literal energy that built the modern world. And it transformed brewing from a local craft into a global industry. So, porter is the hero of the Industrial Revolution. It's the cheap, high-calorie fuel that built our modern world, the liquid bread that powered the first factory workers. It's a great story, full of progress and innovation. But it's only half the story. Because at the exact same moment that London's porters were happily drinking their namesake beer, another, far more destructive drink was tearing the city to absolute shreds. This wasn't beer. This was gin, and the period it unleashed on London is still known as the gin craze. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just a few people overdoing it on a Saturday night. This was a full-blown social catastrophe. Thanks to a glut of cheap grain and a total lack of regulation, gin, a spirit far stronger and more intoxicating than beer, was cheaper than bread. There were thousands of informal gin shops all over the city, with signs that famously promised, drunk for a penny, dead drunk for twopence. And people took them up on the offer. The city descended into a kind of alcoholic nightmare. Crime skyrocketed. Death rates surged past birth rates. People sold their children, their clothes, the very boards from their homes, just to get another hit. It was an apocalypse in slow motion. So what does the government do? They're watching their new industrial workforce literally drink itself to death. A ban seems obvious, right? Wrong. Instead, they did something far more interesting. They launched one of the first and most effective public health propaganda campaigns in history. For that, they turned to the artist William Hogarth, who in 1751 created two of the most famous engravings in British history. The first was called Gin Lane, and it is absolutely horrifying. It's a vision of hell on earth. A skeletal man starves in the street while a mother, so drunk she doesn't even notice, lets her baby fall to its death from her arms. A man has hanged himself in a ruined building. People are fighting, dying, and selling their tools, the very means of their survival, for one more drink. It's complete chaos and despair. But Hogarth didn't just show people the nightmare, he also showed them the alternative. He published a second engraving right alongside it. It was called Beer Street. And Beer Street is the total opposite. It's a paradise of productivity. Here, everyone is plump, happy, and hard at work. Benevolent brewers hand out free pints. Well-dressed citizens are reading newspapers and flirting. In the background, new buildings are being constructed. The only person suffering is the pawnbroker, whose shop is literally falling apart from lack of business. The message couldn't be clearer. Gin leads to ruin and death. Beer leads to health, prosperity, and a strong society. This wasn't just art, this was policy. The government, in concert with the powerful brewers, consciously and very publicly framed beer as the healthy, patriotic, responsible choice. It was the drink of moderation, the drink of the industrious Englishman. Gin was the poison, beer was the antidote. For the first time, beer wasn't just a fuel or a currency. It was now an official instrument of social control, a moral force actively promoted by the state to hold civilization together. All right, so beer is now the official drink of a healthy, productive, and prosperous England. It's the moral antidote to the poison of gin. And with the British Empire expanding at a breathtaking rate, that drink was about to follow the flag to every corner of the globe. But this created a brand new and very serious technical problem, the problem of India. Think about it. By the late 1700s, there were tens of thousands of British soldiers, administrators, and merchants living in the British Raj. And they wanted a taste of home. They wanted their beer. But the journey from London to Calcutta was a 6-month nightmare. A ship had to cross the Atlantic, sail down past Africa, and then cross the equator twice before it even got to the Indian Ocean. The dark, heavy porters that were so popular back home just couldn't survive the trip. The relentless heat and the constant rocking of the ship would spoil the casks, turning the precious cargo into sour, undrinkable vinegar. So, how do you solve this? How do you engineer a beer that can survive half a year at sea and 2 trips through the tropics? Well, London's brewers fell back on the same technology that had won the beer wars 2 centuries earlier: hops. And lots of them. The logic was simple. If hops are a preservative, then a massive amount of hops should be a massive preservative. At the same time, they tweaked the recipes for their lighter, paler ales, cranking up the alcohol content, which also helped fight spoilage. And here's the thing, they weren't trying to invent a new flavour. They were just trying to solve a shipping problem. It was a purely pragmatic, technological fix. But the result was completely unintentional, and it was revolutionary. This new, highly hopped, high alcohol, pale ale prepared for the India market arrived in Calcutta not just intact, but transformed. The massive dose of hops had infused the beer with an intensely bitter, floral, and aromatic character that was unlike anything anyone had ever tasted before. It was sharp, it was refreshing, and in the blistering heat of India, it was an absolute revelation. The soldiers and civilians loved it. They started specifically requesting this India Pale Ale, and a style of beer that was born from a simple logistical challenge. The need to keep beer from going bad on a long, hot trip accidentally became one of the most iconic and influential flavour profiles in the entire history of brewing. An accidental invention that would, a full 200 years later, become the signature taste of a whole new revolution in America. So, we've just seen how a simple shipping problem in the British Empire led to the accidental creation of one of the world's most iconic beer styles. But that wasn't the last time a major crisis involving spoiled beer would change the world. In fact, the next one would lead to arguably the single greatest scientific breakthrough in modern history. Now, here's a name you definitely know, Louis Pasteur. And when you hear that name, you think of one thing, right? Milk. Clean, safe milk for children. Pasteurization. He's the kindly scientist who figured out how to kill the dangerous germs in dairy and saved countless lives. It's a story we all learn in school. But here's the thing. That whole story leaves out the most important, and frankly, the most interesting part. Louis Pasteur wasn't originally trying to save the children. He was trying to save the beer. To understand how this happened, we have to go to France in the immediate aftermath of the disastrous Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The French had been completely and utterly humiliated. Their armies were crushed, their emperor was captured, and their national pride was in tatters. And to add insult to injury, they were being beaten on another front, the bar. German beer, especially the new crisp lagers, was storming the world market, renowned for its consistency and quality. French beer, on the other hand, had a terrible reputation. It was notoriously unstable and kept spoiling, turning sour in the cask. It was another national embarrassment. So, in a desperate bid to win back some national honour and a whole lot of market share, the brewers of France went to their most famous living scientist with a simple question. Why does our beer keep going bad, and what can we possibly do to stop it? And that's exactly what Pasteur did. He took samples of spoiled French beer and put them under his microscope. And he saw what no one had truly understood before. The beer was teeming with tiny living microorganisms that weren't yeast. These were wild microbes, bacteria, that were contaminating the brew and making it sour. Then he made the crucial leap. He discovered that by gently heating the beer to a very specific temperature before it was bottled, he could kill off these unwanted organisms without affecting the flavour. He called the process pasteurization. In 1876, he published his monumental, world-changing findings in a book. And the title of that book was not Studies on Milk, it was Études sur la bière, Studies on Beer. That's right. The germ theory of disease, the scientific breakthrough that laid the foundation for modern medicine, surgery, and public health for the entire planet, was funded by and confirmed through the study of spoiled beer. All because the French were sick of losing to the Germans. It was only later that the process was applied to wine and eventually to milk. Once again, a simple pint was the catalyst for a revolution that would change everything. So, Pasteur's big breakthrough was all about stopping French beer from going bad, a desperate attempt to compete with the Germans. But it begs an even bigger question. Why was German beer so much better and more consistent in the first place? And the answer comes down to a fundamental split in the beer family tree, a division that happened centuries earlier. Basically, for all of history up to this point, almost every beer we've talked about, from Sumerian porridge to English porter, was an ale. Ales are made with a type of yeast that loves to work at warm temperatures, bubbling away at the top of the fermenter. It's fast, it's robust, it gets the job done. But there was another way, a much more difficult way. It was called lager. The word literally means to store, in German, and it was made with a totally different kind of yeast, one that worked slowly, at the bottom of the tank, and only at temperatures just a few degrees above freezing. The result was a beer that was incredibly crisp, clean, and stable. The problem was, how do you keep beer that cold for weeks on end? For centuries, the only way was to brew during the winter and then store, or lager, the barrels in deep, dark caves packed with tons of ice cut from frozen lakes and rivers. It was a seasonal, geographical, and logistical nightmare. Until one invention blew the whole system wide open: artificial refrigeration. This is where a German engineer named Carl von Linde comes in and changes absolutely everything. In the 1870s, he perfected the first practical industrial-scale refrigeration system. And suddenly, you didn't need a frozen lake or a deep cave. You could have that perfect lager brewing cold on demand, anywhere in the world, any day of the year. And this innovation arrived at the exact perfect moment for a massive wave of German immigrants who were flooding into America. Men with names you definitely recognize: Anheuser, Busch, Miller, Pabst, Coors. They all brought with them the knowledge and the thirst for crisp, clean lager. And now, thanks to refrigeration, they could build massive breweries in the middle of hot American summers, in St. Louis, in Milwaukee, in Golden, Colorado. The age of the small, seasonal brewhouse was over. The age of the industrial beer giant was about to begin. Alright, so we have Pasteur figuring out how to kill the bad microbes, and Carl von Linde giving us the refrigeration to make crisp, clean lager beer anywhere in the world. And in America, a generation of German brewers are building massive industrial breweries. The modern world of beer is roaring to life. But there was still one enormous fundamental problem. Even with pasteurization and refrigeration, brewing was still a bit of a lottery. Pasteur knew that yeast was the good guy, the microbe you wanted. But nobody understood that yeast wasn't just one thing. It was a whole family of different organisms, and just like any family, some members were great to have around, and others could ruin the whole party. brewers were still pitching a mix of wild and cultivated yeast strains into their tanks, and you never knew which one would win. Sometimes you'd get a beautiful, clean lager, and sometimes you'd get a sour, funky mess, a phenomenon they called beer sickness. Which brings us to Denmark, and to a brewery that would give the world the final missing piece of the puzzle. The Carlsberg Brewery. Now, its founder, J.C. Jacobsen, wasn't just a businessman. He was obsessed with science. He believed that brewing could be perfected, that it could be turned from a mystical art into a predictable, repeatable process. And so, in 1875, he did something radical. He founded the Carlsberg Laboratory, a cutting-edge research center dedicated to nothing but the science of brewing, and he hired a brilliant young mycologist named Emil Hansen. Hansen took Pasteur's work one giant, revolutionary step further. He realized the problem wasn't just about keeping bad bacteria out. It was about making sure only the single best yeast strain got in. He developed a groundbreaking new method for isolating a single, perfect yeast cell and then cultivating a pure, unadulterated culture from that one cell. It was like finding the one perfect seed that could grow an entire forest of identical, flawless trees. And in 1883 he found it. He isolated the single strain of lager yeast that produced the cleanest, most stable, and most delicious beer imaginable. He named it Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, the bottom fermenting yeast from Carlsberg. This was it. This was the Holy Grail, the key that unlocked the modern world of beer. Suddenly, you could remove all the guesswork. You could guarantee that every single batch, every pint, every bottle would taste exactly the same. Perfect. Every single time. This is the technology that allowed those industrial giants like Anheuser-Busch and Miller to become giants in the first place, ensuring their beer tasted the same in St. Louis as it did in San Francisco. But here is the most incredible and most important part of the story. J.C. Jacobsen, the man who had funded this world-changing discovery, could have patented it. He could have made Carlsberg the sole gatekeeper of perfect beer, a monopoly that would have made him the richest man on the planet. But he didn't. In an act of unbelievable scientific generosity, he gave it away, for free, to anyone who asked. He sent pure cultures of Carlsberg yeast, bottom fermenting number 1, to breweries all over the world, including his biggest competitors like Heineken and Tuborg. He believed that the advancement of the entire industry was more important than his own profit. And with that single act, brewing was officially no longer an art. It was an industrial chemical process, replicable anywhere on Earth. The age of consistent, mass-produced, globalized beer had finally, truly begun. So, J.C. Jacobsen gives away the key to the kingdom. The holy grail of industrial brewing, a single, perfect yeast cell, is suddenly available to anyone who asks for it. And what happened next was as predictable as it was revolutionary. That piece of open-source biology, sent out for free from the Carlsberg labs, wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a weapon. And in America, the German brewing giants, the Anhäusers, the Buschs, the Millers, the Pabsts, were ready to use it. They already had the massive factories, they had the industrial refrigeration, and now they had the final, missing piece, the code for perfect, repeatable consistency. And they created a new kind of beer for a new kind of world. Using that clean lager yeast with cheap, abundant American grains like rice and corn, they engineered a product that was light, crisp, refreshing, and above all, incredibly consistent. A beer made in St. Louis would taste exactly the same as one made 1,000 miles away. It was the ultimate industrial product. Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and their kin didn't just build breweries, they built empires. But this triumph came at a staggering cost. The thousands of smaller, local breweries making their quirky regional ales, porters, and stouts couldn't compete. They were simply washed away. The incredible diversity that had defined brewing for millennia, the very thing that made French beer different from German or English from Bavarian, was almost totally erased. replaced by a single, dominant golden-yellow tide of American light lager. And for the better part of a century, that was the end of the story. The great branching river of beer that had flowed through all of human history had been consolidated, controlled, and funneled into one massive, predictable stream. And maybe that's the final ironic twist in our journey. Maybe that uniformity is the reason we forgot just how important this drink really is. We started this episode talking about a simple, cheap drink that we don't really give much respect. Just a cold one after mowing the lawn. But after everything we've seen, how can you not respect it? This wasn't a party drink. This was the survival technology that convinced our ancestors to stop wandering and build the first societies. This was liquid bread and sterile water, the key that unlocked civilization itself. It was the wage that was paid to the laborers who built the pyramids. It was the public health system of Babylon, where watering down the beer was a crime punishable by death. It was a political statement during the Reformation, the fuel for the British Empire, and the engine oil of the Industrial Revolution. Its flaws led Louis Pasteur to the germ theory of disease, the very foundation of modern medicine. Every single one of those world-changing moments is still in your glass. That simple, cheap drink in your hand is a liquid fossil, a direct connection back to the very first farmers, the builders of monuments, the thinkers, the fighters, and the innovators who came before us. The story of beer isn't just a footnote in the story of humanity. In so many forgotten ways, the story of beer is the story of humanity. And every sip is a taste of the incredible, winding and world-shaping journey that got us here. All right, so that seems like the end of the road, right? From a survival technology to an industrial commodity, from a chunky, nutritious gruel to a crisp, clean, mass-produced light lager. The story feels complete. The beer in your hand has been perfected, pasteurized, refrigerated, and brewed with a single, flawless yeast cell. But what if I told you there was one more revolution to come? One final, critical innovation that had almost nothing to do with the liquid in the bottle, but everything to do with the bottle itself. An innovation that would fundamentally change not just the beer industry, but our personal relationship with it. For pretty much all of history, to drink beer, you had to go to it. It lived in a big container, a Sumerian ceramic pot, a Viking horn, a medieval wooden cask, a tavern keg. You went to the pub, the beer hall, the alehouse, and you drank it there with other people. It was an inherently social public act. And then two inventions came along and blew that all apart. The first was the automatic bottling machine, perfected by an inventor named Michael Owens in 1904. Suddenly, brewers could fill thousands upon thousands of individual person-sized glass bottles an hour. But that created a huge new problem. How do you seal them? How do you keep the beer fresh and, more importantly, keep the carbonation in? Corks were expensive, leaky, and a huge pain. The solution came from a man named William Painter, and it was a work of absolute genius. It was called the crown cork. We just call it a bottle cap. That simple, crimped piece of metal with a cork liner on the inside was cheap. It was disposable, and it created a perfect airtight seal. And when you combine the automated bottling machine with the cheap, perfect seal of the crown cap, something incredible happens. Beer leaves the pub. For the first time in 10,000 years, beer could be taken home, easily and on a mass scale. It could be stored in your icebox, and later, your refrigerator. The act of drinking, which for millennia had been communal by necessity, could now be private, solitary. The very idea of grabbing a cold one from the fridge after work, of drinking a beer while watching TV, of the six-pack itself, none of it would exist without the humble bottle cap. It was the final step, the one that took beer from the public square to the private home and completed its journey into the beverage we know today. It's the innovation that allows us to have that personal, quiet moment with this drink that has had such a loud and dramatic public history. And that's really the final, quiet revolution in this whole epic saga, isn't it? The humble bottle cap. Because it didn't just change how beer was sold, it completely rewired our relationship with it. For 10,000 years, Drinking beer was something you did out there, with other people. In the Sumerian temple, the Viking mead hall, the London pub. It was, by its very nature, a public act. But that simple crimped piece of metal, it brought beer home. It made it personal. It's the reason you can have a cold one waiting for you in your own fridge. It's the final innovation that took this world-shaping liquid and tucked it quietly into the background of our private lives. And maybe that's the perfect place to leave our story, because that whole incredible journey is now complete. We followed this drink from a gritty, life-saving porridge in the Fertile Crescent all the way to the cold, clean, capped bottle in your hand. We started this whole thing by saying we don't give this drink much respect, that it's just for fun. But after this journey, how could you ever see it that way again? Think about what we've seen. This wasn't just a drink. It was the survival technology that convinced our ancestors to stop wandering and build civilization. It was the wage that built the pyramids and the public health system so vital that watering it down was a crime punishable by death. It was the dividing line between the wine-drinking South and the beer-drinking North, a schism that would define Europe for 1,000 years. It was a theological loophole for starving monks, a political weapon in the Protestant Reformation, and the fuel that powered the British Empire. The accidental need to ship it to India gave us the IPA. The desperate need to stop it from spoiling in France led Louis Pasteur to the germ theory of disease, the very foundation of modern medicine. The quest to perfect it gave us refrigeration, pure yeast cultures, and the first truly globalized industrial product. From the dawn of agriculture to the floor of your kitchen, the story of humanity has been inextricably tied to this one: simple drink. So the next time you reach for one, whatever it is, a pilsner, a porter, a light lager, just take a second before you open it. That bottle isn't just holding beer, it's holding history. It's a direct, liquid link to the first farmers, the pyramid builders, the medieval monks, the revolutionaries, and the scientists who, in their own quest for a better drink, accidentally built the world we live in today. The story of beer really is the story of us, and you're holding the final chapter.